Picture this: the year is 1347, and a shadow creeps across Europe. Villages empty overnight. Whispers of an unseen terror spread faster than fire. People vanish without explanation, leaving behind only cold hearts and unanswered questions. This wasn't just fear of the Black Death, this was something stranger, something lost to time. Because the medieval world wasn't just knights and castles, it was a labyrinth of mysteries so baffling, they've slipped through the cracks of history until now. From disappearing armies to cursed relics that defy logic, the Middle Ages were a breeding ground for the inexplicable. Think about it. Why would an entire ship's crew abandon their vessel mid-voyage, leaving breakfast still warm on the table? How could a single, unreadable manuscript stump scholars for 6 centuries? These aren't just gaps in the record, they're riddles that whisper to us across the ages, teasing us with the possibility of answers just out of reach. And that's where our journey begins. Together, we're peeling back the layers of time to uncover 30 of the most haunting, head-scratching enigmas the medieval world left behind. We'll stand in the footprints of vanished civilizations, decode symbols meant to stay secret forever, and question whether some of these puzzles were never meant to be solved. Because history isn't just about what we know, it's about what still hides in the shadows, waiting to unsettle, astonish, and rewrite everything we thought was true. Ready to step into the unknown, let's begin. Deep in the misty highlands of Roman Britain, one of history's most enduring military mysteries unfolded. The mighty 9th Legion, Rome's elite force of 5,000 battle-hardened soldiers, marched into the northern wilds and simply vanished. No triumphant return, no records of defeat, just silence. How does an entire legion, armed to the teeth and trained for conquest, dissolve into thin air? Theories swirl like the fogs of Caledonia. Some say they were wiped out in a brutal ambush by the Picts, those tattooed warriors who painted themselves blue to terrify their enemies. Others whisper of rebellion, maybe the legion, sick of Rome's endless campaigns, deserted en masse and melted into the landscape. But here's where it gets stranger. Recent archaeology hints they might not have been destroyed at all. A single tile stamp bearing the 9th emblem was found in the Netherlands, suggesting they could have been quietly reassigned, their disappearance just a bureaucratic oversight. Yet folklore won't let go of the darker version. Local legends speak of ghostly soldiers marching in formation near Hadrian's Wall, their armor clinking in the wind. Even Rosemary Sutcliffe's iconic novel, The Eagle of the Ninth, immortalized the idea of a doomed last stand. But truth we may never know. The real tragedy isn't just their fate, it's how history can swallow even the mightiest whole, leaving behind only whispers and wonder. So was it a massacre, a mutiny, or a mundane paperwork error? The 9th's disappearance holds up a mirror to how fragile our grasp on the past really is. And that's the spine-tingling beauty of medieval mysteries. Sometimes the unanswered questions haunt us more than the answers ever could. Now imagine holding a book filled with secrets no one alive today can read. That's exactly what the Voynich Manuscript is, a 240-page enigma from the 15th century, brimming with strange plants that don't exist, naked women bathing in green liquid, and a script so peculiar it's defied every codebreaker for centuries. Who wrote it? Why? And why would someone go to such lengths to create a book nobody could understand? The moment you see its pages, you know something's off. The illustrations are unsettlingly precise yet utterly alien. Herbs with twisted roots, zodiac wheels with unfamiliar constellations, even tubes and pipes that look suspiciously like early scientific diagrams. Then there's the text itself, a flowing script of 20 to 30 unique characters, dancing across the page in patterns that almost resemble language but not quite. It's this eerie, almost that's tormented scholars since the manuscript resurfaced in 1912. And oh, the theories. Some say it's the work of a medieval con artist, an elaborate hoax to swindle a wealthy patron. Others argue it's a lost herbal lexicon, encrypted to protect medicinal secrets. Then there's the wilder angle. Could it be an artifact from an unknown culture, or even, as one scientist controversially claimed, a message from extraterrestrials? The most compelling clue might be its carbon dating. The vellum pages trace back to the early 1400s, placing it squarely in the era of alchemy and esoteric knowledge. Modern technology hasn't cracked it either. Supercomputers, AI algorithms, even wartime codebreakers all have failed to find meaningful patterns. The closest anyone came was a botanist who swore some plants matched species from Mexico, which only deepened the mystery. How would a 15th century European have knowledge of New World flora decades before Columbus sailed? But here's the chilling part: what if it was meant to stay unreadable? Some texts were written purely as spiritual exercises, the act of writing itself sacred, the content irrelevant. Or perhaps it's a cipher so clever the key died with its author. Either way, the Voynich Manuscript mocks us from across time, a puzzle that refuses to surrender, and maybe that's its real lesson. Some secrets aren't meant to be solved, they're meant to keep us wondering. Somewhere in the autumn of the 12th century, the fields of Woolpit held a secret no one could explain. Reapers cutting crops near the village trenches stumbled upon two terrified children, brother and sister, with skin the color of moss, babbling in an unknown tongue. Their clothes woven from some unidentifiable fabric. Their diet, they refused all food until someone offered them raw green beans. And just like that, the legend of the Green Children of Woolpit was born. First, the facts as recorded by medieval chroniclers. These weren't fleeting apparitions. The boy, frail and sickly, soon perished, but the girl survived, eventually learning English and shedding her eerie green hue. When questioned, she described a twilight land where the sun never rose, a place her people called St. Martin's Land, somewhere beyond a great river. Was she recounting a distant realm or something far stranger? The theories split wide open. Folklore enthusiasts latch onto the extraterrestrial angle. Could these children have been visitors from another world, their green skin a result of copper-based blood, their land without sun, a planet orbiting a dim star? Skeptics counter with medical explanations: arsenic poisoning from abandoned mine shafts, or even hypochromic anemia, a condition that can give skin a greenish pallor during famines. Then there's the linguistic puzzle. Some scholars suggest the children spoke Flemish, a language foreign to rural Suffolk. Could they have been refugees from a nearby enclave, disoriented and malnourished after wandering the wilderness? But here's the detail that chills. The girl claimed she and her brother had been herding livestock when they heard bells, church bells, and followed the sound into a cavern, emerging dazed into Woolpit's sunlight. Bells, the very instrument that marked Christian time, calling the faithful to prayer. Was this a symbolic crossing, a slip between worlds, or merely the confused memory of a traumatized child? Medieval Europe was a cauldron of myth and migration, where the unexplained often got folded into religious allegory. Maybe the Green Children were a morality tale about lost souls finding salvation, quite literally brought into the light. Or perhaps they were the victims of a darker truth, kidnapped, abandoned, or even deliberately mutilated to fuel a local legend. The girl assimilated, married a local man, and faded into history. But her story lingers, a Rorschach test for every era that rediscovers it. Because whether they were aliens, accident victims, or something in between, the Green Children force us to ask, how many other whispers from the past are waiting to be deciphered? And how many will we never understand? It started with a single woman in the sweltering summer of 1518, twitching in the streets of Strasbourg. Within days, dozens more joined her, their limbs jerking, feet pounding against cobblestones, bodies convulsing to a beat only they could hear. By month's end, over 400 people were caught in the grip of the dancing plague, dancing until their feet bled, until they collapsed from exhaustion or worse. This wasn't celebration, this was sheer, inexplicable torment. The city's records paint a visceral picture, nobles and peasants alike gripped by an uncontrollable frenzy. Local physicians, baffled, blamed hot blood and prescribed more dancing, even hiring musicians and erecting stages, as if leaning into the madness might cure it. Some victims reportedly danced for days without sleep, their hearts giving out mid-step. Others screamed for help even as their bodies refused to stop moving. What could possibly explain such a nightmare? Medieval minds reached for supernatural causes, divine punishment, demonic possession, or the curse of Saint Vitus, a martyr invoked against nervous disorders. But modern science offers darker possibilities. One leading theory, mass psychogenic illness, a kind of collective hysteria where stress manifests as physical symptoms. Strasbourg at the time was drowning in famine, disease, and religious anxiety. Could the dancing have been a somatic scream, bodies expressing what minds couldn't process? Then there's the ergotism angle. Rye bread contaminated with ergot fungus, the same compound later used to make LSD, could induce hallucinations and spasms. But why dancing, and why here? Historians note similar outbreaks dotted across medieval Europe, always in times of extreme societal strain. The afflicted weren't choosing to move, they were prisoners of their own muscles, as if some invisible puppeteer held their strings. The most haunting question lingers: was it purely psychological or something more? Recent studies in neurobiology suggest extreme stress can trigger automatic movement disorders, blurring the line between mind and body. Yet even now, Strasbourg's dancers defy easy explanation. They remind us how fragile human psychology can be, how easily a community can tip from order into chaos, dancing toward the abyss together. And maybe that's the real horror, not the mystery itself, but what it reveals about the fine line between control and collapse. 5 centuries later, those frantic footsteps still echo, a warning etched in history's ledger. Sometimes the body remembers what the mind tries to forget. Beneath the cobblestone streets of Moscow, rumor whispers of a treasure far more precious than gold, a lost library said to hold the wisdom of Byzantium, the secrets of ancient Alexandria, and texts so rare their discovery could rewrite history. This is the fabled collection of Ivan the Terrible, Russia's infamous Tsar, who reportedly amassed thousands of manuscripts in a hidden underground vault. But after his death in 1584, the library vanished without a trace. Was it destroyed, hidden, or does it still lie buried, waiting to be found? The legend begins with Ivan's marriage to Byzantine Princess Sophia Palaeologina, whose dowry allegedly included cartloads of rare books salvaged from Constantinople's fallen empire. Chronicles describe a Tsar obsessed with knowledge, hoarding scrolls on alchemy, astronomy, and even forbidden magic. But here's the twist: no inventory survives. We're left with tantalizing fragments, a monk's diary mentioning a great storehouse beneath the Kremlin, or ambassadors' accounts of shadowed corridors lined with chests groaning under the weight of books. Excavations have teased hope for centuries. In the early 1900s, archaeologist Ignatius Steletsky became obsessed, digging beneath the Kremlin's foundations with little more than a pickaxe and sheer determination. He claimed to find a hidden chamber only for Soviet officials to abruptly halt his work. Conspiracy, or was the government silencing a discovery too explosive to reveal? Modern ground-penetrating radar hints at hollow spaces beneath the Arsenal Tower, but bureaucratic red tape keeps archaeologists at bay. Then there's the darker theory. Some historians argue the library never existed, that it was propaganda to bolster Ivan's image as an enlightened ruler, masking his brutal reign. Others speculate the collection was dispersed during the time of troubles, looted by Polish invaders, or sold off piecemeal to fund wars. But the most haunting possibility, that it's still down there, preserved in the cold, dry air of a forgotten cellar. Imagine uncovering Aristotle's lost dialogues or early Christian Gospels deemed too radical for canon. The weight of that knowledge, untouched for centuries, is enough to make any historian's hands tremble. Whether myth or reality, the lost library endures as a ghost in Russia's cultural memory. Because some mysteries aren't just about what was lost, but what might still be found. The tale begins with a whisper in the 13th century chronicles, a shadowy figure lingering at the edges of history, watching empires rise and fall without ever resting his feet. They called him the Wandering Jew, a man cursed by Christ himself to walk the earth until the second coming. According to the legend, as Jesus struggled toward Calvary under the weight of the cross, he paused to rest against a cobbler's shop. The owner, a man named Ahasuerus, shoved him away and mocked his suffering. In that moment, the sentence was pronounced, "You will wander until I return." What makes this story so chilling isn't just the curse, it's how persistently it haunted the medieval imagination. By the 1600s, sightings piled up across Europe. A gaunt, weary traveler in Hamburg, another in Vienna, always recounting the same tale with eerie precision. Each account added layers. Some said he couldn't die, others claimed he aged a century every 30 years, his body resetting like some macabre hourglass. But here's the twist, early versions didn't even name him. The Wandering Jew label only solidified in the 1500s when a Lutheran pamphlet spread the story as a warning against unbelief. Scholars still debate its roots. Some trace it to biblical passages hinting at John the Evangelist's immortality, or to pre-Christian myths like the doomed figure of the Flying Dutchman. Others see a darker social commentary, a scapegoat for medieval Europe's anxieties about outsiders, or even a metaphor for the Jewish diaspora itself. The legend mutated with each retelling. In Spain, he became a cautionary tale for converts reluctant to embrace Christianity. In Germany, a ghostly reminder of divine justice. Yet the most fascinating detail, how real he felt. In 1235, an Armenian archbishop claimed to have dined with him in Armenia. Centuries later, a Swiss doctor wrote of meeting a man in Lisbon who spoke every language fluently and sighed about witnessing the crucifixion. Whether hoax, mass hysteria, or something stranger, these encounters fed the myth's grip on the medieval mind. And perhaps that's the real power of the Wandering Jew, not as a single man, but as a mirror. In an age of plagues and upheaval, he embodied the terror of endless survival, of outliving everyone you love. He was the ultimate outsider, condemned to watch history unfold without ever belonging to it. Even now, his legend lingers, asking us, what's more terrifying, the idea of dying too soon or living too long? On a calm autumn morning in 1375, fishermen off the coast of Brittany spotted a vessel drifting silently toward shore. Its sails hung limp but intact, ropes coiled neatly on deck, as if the crew had simply stepped away moments before. When they boarded, they found fresh bread in the galley, lanterns still burning low, and a half-finished game of dice scattered near the helm. But not a single soul remained. This wasn't the infamous Mary Celeste of the 19th century. This was her medieval predecessor, the Saint Marie, vanishing into legend centuries before the term ghost ship entered popular lore. Medieval maritime records are littered with such eerie accounts. Take the Griffin of Flanders, found adrift in the North Sea in 1403 with its cargo of Flemish wool untouched, its lifeboat still secured. Or the St. Clement, discovered near Cyprus with its hold full of Venetian glassware too valuable to abandon, yet not a single piece was missing. But the St. Marie stands out because of the chilling details. A scribe's journal from the period describes finding the captain's logbook open to an entry dated just 2 days prior, noting calm seas and fair winds. No storm could explain it, no signs of struggle, no bloodstains, not even the telltale marks of piracy. So what happened? Theories range from the plausible to the fantastical. Some historians point to St. Elmo's fire, a weather phenomenon where electrical charges made ships' masts glow eerily, enough to spook superstitious sailors into abandoning ship. Others suggest carbon monoxide poisoning from poorly ventilated cargo holds, like rotting grain fermenting silently below deck. But here's the oddest clue. The St. Marie's navigational charts were found carefully stowed while the ship's compass was missing. Had the crew been lured off course by something they couldn't resist? Folklore offers darker answers. Breton fishermen whispered of the Silent Ones, spirits said to mimic human voices to draw sailors into the waves. There's also the legend of the Flying Dutchman, which some trace not to the 17th century, but to earlier medieval tales of ships doomed to sail forever. Yet the St. Marie's cargo barrels of French wine was never touched. If pirates or mutiny were to blame, why leave valuables behind? Modern researchers have floated another idea: mass psychological panic. Imagine a crew convinced they'd seen a sea monster or an omen in the clouds, fleeing in the single lifeboat that later sank. Without survivors, the truth dissolved into speculation. But the St. Marie's greatest mystery isn't just the absence of its crew. It's how perfectly preserved their last moments were. A snapshot of medieval life frozen in time, whispering across 6 centuries that sometimes the sea doesn't just claim lives, it erases them without a trace. Perhaps that's why these stories grip us. They're not about death but disappearance, the unsettling idea that the world can swallow people whole, leaving only questions bobbing in their wake. And in an age without radios or black boxes, the ocean kept its secrets well. For every Mary Celeste that captures the world's imagination, remember, she had ancestors older and just as haunted, their names whispered only in crumbling port ledgers and the dreams of those who still wonder what waits in the mist. One February morning in 1855, the villagers of Devon woke to a sight that defied logic. Overnight, a trail of hoof prints, each cloven like a devil's, had been burned into the snow, stretching for over 100 miles. They scaled rooftops, vanished mid-stride atop haystacks, and even appeared to pass straight through solid walls. Panic erupted. Had Satan himself stalked the countryside, or was this something even older, something medieval Europe had feared for centuries? Because this wasn't an isolated event. Centuries before Devon's terror, similar marks haunted the frozen landscapes of Germany, Switzerland, and even the Baltic coast, always appearing after bitter winters, always disappearing without explanation. The medieval records read like pages from a horror manuscript. In 1521, Swiss farmers discovered tracks, as though made by a horse shod with fire, circling their village before vanishing into thin air. A chronicle from 1485 describes Baltic fishermen finding prints, deeper than any beast could make, leading from the shore into the forest where no trees bore signs of disturbance. Even earlier, in 1337, a French monk wrote of footprints burned into the frost outside his monastery, forming a perfect spiral no human or animal could have created. The common thread: these weren't random scratches. The tracks showed purpose, intelligence, as if something had paused, pivoted, even climbed vertical surfaces with unnatural ease. So what caused them? Victorian England blamed everything from escaped kangaroos to experimental balloons, but medieval minds went darker. Some saw them as omens, the literal footsteps of death riding ahead of the Black Plague. Others whispered of the Wild Hunt, a spectral procession from Norse myth said to claim souls during winter storms. Modern theories range from freak atmospheric phenomena, where electrical discharges left scorch marks, to the sudden thaw and refreeze of unusual animal tracks. Yet none fully explain the precision, the sheer scale, or why these prints cluster around periods of societal collapse like the years after the Great Famine of 1315 or the turmoil of the Reformation. Perhaps the most unsettling detail comes from Devon itself. Witnesses swore the prints smelled of sulfur, and isn't that just like history, to hand us a mystery wrapped in folklore, daring us to separate fact from fear? Because whether it was hoaxes, hallucinations, or something beyond our understanding, these tracks remind us how easily the unknown becomes the monstrous. And sometimes the only thing more terrifying than an answer is the realization that there might not be one. On a frigid Friday the 13th in 1307, King Philip IV of France made his move. At dawn, Templar knights across the realm were dragged from their beds, charged with heresy, blasphemy, and unspeakable rituals. Within years, the most powerful military order in Christendom was annihilated, its leaders burned at the stake, its vast wealth confiscated. But here's what history books often miss: the whispers that followed, because the Templars didn't just vanish. They left behind a trail of curses, hidden knowledge, and a legend so potent it still haunts treasure hunters today. Start with the facts. These warrior monks weren't just soldiers. They were Europe's first bankers, its most sophisticated architects, and possibly its most secretive scholars. During the Crusades, they excavated beneath Jerusalem's Temple Mount what some believe was a deliberate hunt for ancient relics. Rumors swirled: had they found the Ark of the Covenant? Fragments of the true cross, even the Holy Grail itself. Their sudden wealth and influence fueled speculation, but their real treasure might have been far stranger. Take the Chinon parchment, a Vatican document rediscovered in 2001. It reveals that under torture, Grand Master Jacques de Molay confessed to spitting on the cross, yet the Pope absolved him in secret. Why? Some scholars argue the Templars practiced a form of initiation ritual, deliberately desecrating symbols to prove loyalty. Others whisper of something darker: contact with Gnostic or even Islamic mystics, absorbing teachings that threatened church orthodoxy. Then there's the curse. As flames consumed de Molay in 1314, he allegedly shouted that Philip and Pope Clement would join him within a year. Both died within months, one of a stroke, the other of a sudden illness. Coincidence, perhaps, but consider this. When revolutionaries exhumed Philip's remains in 1793, his skull reportedly crumbled to dust on contact, as if decay had accelerated unnaturally. Modern quests for Templar secrets read like adventure novels. From Rennes le Chateau's coded parchments to Oak Island's infamous money pit, each site ties back to their legacy. Yet the greatest mystery isn't what they hid, it's why their knowledge terrified the establishment enough to erase them. Were they guardians of lost Christian heterodoxy? Custodians of pre-Christian wisdom, or simply victims of a king's insatiable greed? The truth may lie in their architecture. Study Chartres Cathedral, built with Templar funding. Its labyrinth floor mirrors the pattern of Jerusalem's streets, and its stained glass encodes celestial alignments known only to medieval astronomers. These weren't just builders, they were transmitting something that couldn't be written down. So did the Templars' treasure ever exist? In a way, yes. Not as gold or jewels, but as an idea. That history's most powerful truths aren't found in daylight, but in the shadows cast by those who tried to silence them. And maybe that's the real curse, not a supernatural vengeance, but the gnawing certainty that we'll never know how much was lost when the last torch flickered out on that Parisian pyre. In the year 1595, as workers dug into Granada's Sacrement hillside, their shovels struck metal, not gold or silver, but sheets of lead carefully inscribed with cryptic symbols. These weren't ordinary artifacts. The thin, folded tablets bore texts in a mix of Latin, Arabic, and an unknown script, claiming to be first-century Christian revelations hidden for over 1,500 years. But here's where the mystery deepens. The writing spoke of intimate details from the lives of Christ and the Virgin Mary, including a stunning assertion that Mary herself had walked the streets of Spain. At first, the discovery electrified the Catholic world. Scholars pored over the delicate engravings, marveling at their intricate designs: crosses, palm trees, even what appeared to be celestial maps. Local clergy hailed them as divine proof of Spain's sacred destiny, a spiritual counterweight to the Protestant Reformation tearing through Europe. Yet almost immediately, skeptics raised red flags. Why would early Christians in Jerusalem use lead, a material associated with Roman curses, for holy texts? And how did these tablets survive underground for so long without corroding? The debate turned fierce. Some experts, like renowned Arabist Miguel de Luna, argued the script matched ancient Nabatean writing, while others dismissed it as clumsy forgery. Then came the bombshell. The Vatican's own archivists noticed eerie similarities between the Sacramento texts and a known medieval forgery, the lead books of Sahagun. Suddenly, the narrative flipped. Were these tablets an elaborate hoax crafted by Morisco's Muslims forcibly converted to Christianity to fabricate a shared religious heritage and stave off persecution? Modern science has only muddied the waters. Recent metallurgical tests confirm the lead dates to the 1600s, not the 1st century. But here's the twist. Some symbols resemble Paleo-Hebrew characters so obscure they wouldn't have been known to 16th century scholars. So who could have faked them, and with what knowledge? The lead books now sit under lock and key, their secrets still contested. For believers, they're a lost chapter of sacred history. For cynics, a desperate act of cultural survival. But perhaps the real mystery isn't their origin. It's why, after 4 centuries, we still can't look away from these fragile sheets of metal, whispering promises of truths too tantalizing to ignore and just out of reach. Long before the infamous bell which tormented a Tennessee family in the early 1800s, medieval Europe trembled at whispers of something far older, a malice that rattled rafters, mimicked voices, and left bruises on the innocent. One case stands stark in the records, the poltergeist of Woodstock Castle, England, documented with chilling precision by monks in 1323. It began with footsteps. Servants reported hearing boots pacing the castle's upper chambers, though no one was there. Then came the stones. Small pebbles would rain down inside closed rooms, striking walls with impossible force. But the true horror erupted when the entity found its voice. Chronicler Brother Elias described how it would speak in the tones of the dead, mimicking deceased relatives to taunt the living. One night, it shrieked the castle chaplain's secret sins aloud, driving the man to flee in terror. What sets this apart from typical ghost stories is the sheer volume of witnesses. Over 30 people, knights, servants, even visiting nobles signed sworn testimonies describing the same phenomena. The disturbances followed patterns we'd recognize today: objects levitating, beds shaking, and an oppressive cold that clung to certain rooms. Local clergy performed exorcisms, but the entity only laughed, a detail that echoes spine-chillingly through later accounts like the Bell Witch's trademark mockery. Historians have pieced together tantalizing context. The castle's owner, Sir William de Soulis, was rumored to dabble in necromancy. Some whispered he'd bound a familiar spirit to guard his treasures, only to lose control. Others pointed to the castle's foundation stones allegedly taken from a pagan burial mound. But the most unsettling theory comes from modern parapsychologists. They note that Sir William's 12-year-old niece, Johanna, lived at Woodstock during the events. Could she have been an unwitting focus for psychokinetic energy, her adolescent turmoil manifesting as chaos? The haunting ended as abruptly as it began. After 7 months, the stones stopped falling, the voices faded. All that remained were those meticulous church records and a question. How many other medieval demons were actually poltergeists, their true nature obscured by the lens of superstition? Because here's the chilling truth: the Woodstock entity wasn't unique. Scroll through monastic diaries from the period, and you'll find eerily similar cases, from a Breton farmhouse where pots flew like birds in 1408, to a Swiss convent in 1391 where invisible hands wrote blasphemies on the walls. These weren't just ghost stories, they were crises that shook entire communities, recorded with the same gravity as plagues or battles. Perhaps the real mystery isn't whether these events happened, but why we forgot them. Modern paranormal research often acts as if poltergeists were discovered in the Victorian era, ignoring centuries of medieval testimony. The Woodstock case forces us to reconsider not just the past, but the very nature of these phenomena. Are they timeless? Do they evolve with our beliefs? Or is there something about human psychology that conjures the same horrors, era after era, wearing different masks but speaking with the same unearthly voice? October 1216. A royal convoy slogs through the quicks and, like marshes of eastern England, carts sinking axle deep into the mud. At its center rides King John, not the villain of Robin Hood legends, but a broken monarch fleeing civil war, his crown jewels jostling in chests beside him. By nightfall, the treasures would vanish, swallowed whole by the shifting tides of the Wash estuary. 7 centuries later, we're still asking, did the sea claim England's greatest hoard, or was this disappearance more sinister than history admits? The timeline alone reads like a thriller. John had just lost Normandy to France, his barons were in open rebellion, and London had fallen to rebel forces. Desperate, he ordered the crown jewels, gem-encrusted regalia, sacred relics like the sword of Tristram, and enough gold to fund an army transported from Norfolk to the safer stronghold of Newark. Contemporary chroniclers like Roger of Wendover paint a vivid scene. The king's baggage train attempting a shortcut across the tidal flats at low tide, only to be caught mid-crossing by the infamous North Sea surge. Guards reportedly saw treasure chests bobbing in the waves before the water dragged them under, but here's where skepticism creeps in. The Wash estuary isn't some bottomless abyss, it's a relatively shallow basin where major recoveries should be possible. Yet every excavation, from Victorian dredging to modern sonar sweeps, has turned up empty. Could the accident have been a cover? Some historians note that John's own treasurer, William de Braybrook, conveniently avoided the doomed convoy. Others highlight the king's last act before dying days later, issuing a cryptic order to guard the regalia with your lives to knights who'd supposedly already witnessed its loss. Theories spiral from there. Medievalists like Professor David Carpenter suggest the jewels were secretly pawned to mercenaries to buy loyalty, their disappearance blamed on nature to save face. Then there's the Templar connection. John owed the order massive debts, and some speculate the treasure was surrendered as collateral, hidden in their preceptories before the order's dissolution. Even Shakespeare fuels the fire, mentioning in King John how the tide hath filled his hungry mouth with gold. Modern technology has only deepened the intrigue. In 2019, ground-penetrating radar detected metallic anomalies near Sutton Bridge, matching descriptions of the lost route. Divers still comb the estuary, lured by legends of a ghostly lantern flickering beneath the waves on stormy nights, said to mark where the chests lie. But perhaps the most tantalizing clue surfaced in 1986, when a fisherman hauled up a 14th century gold brooch eerily similar to ones described in John's inventory. Was it proof the treasure broke apart, scattered by centuries of currents? What makes this mystery endure isn't just the wealth at stake, it's the symbolism. Those jewels weren't mere ornaments, they were the physical embodiment of royal authority. Their loss left England's next kings to be crowned with cheap replacements, a humiliation that fueled whispers of divine punishment. For treasure hunters, the hunt continues. For historians, it's a forensic puzzle, a king's desperation, a tide's timing, and whispers of betrayal all converging in one muddy stretch of coastline. After 800 years, the Wash hasn't given up its secrets, but it hasn't stopped us from digging either. Deep in the archives of Prague's Strahov Monastery, a crumbling manuscript gathers dust under lock and key. Its pages crackle with strange symbols, circles within circles, serpents swallowing their own tails, and a single phrase repeated like a mantra. Visita interiora terrae rectificando in vinis occultum lapidem. This was the work of an alchemist known only as Magister Edwardus, a shadowy figure who surfaced in Bohemian courts around 1398, whispered to have held the philosopher's stone itself. But was he a visionary scientist centuries ahead of his time, or just another charlatan weaving gold from lies? The legend hinges on one night in 1403, when Holy Roman Emperor Wenceslaus allegedly witnessed Edwardus transform a lump of lead into gold, not through sleight of hand, but by dissolving it in a violet liquid that shimmered like the dawn over Vltava. Within weeks, the alchemist vanished, leaving behind a handful of encrypted notebooks and a workshop littered with glass vessels still crusted with unknown residues. What makes his case extraordinary isn't just the transmutation claim, but the precision of his surviving notes. Modern chemists analyzing his recipes in 2013 made a startling discovery: one formula for aqua regia, a potent acid capable of dissolving gold, matches near perfectly with formulations developed centuries later. Yet the real enigma lies in his diagrams. Edwardus sketched apparatus resembling distillation towers and reflux condensers, tools not formally invented until the 1800s. Even more perplexing are his references to fixed mercury, a substance some historians argue might have been an early isolation of metallic zinc, a process not documented until Renaissance India. Was this borrowed knowledge from Arab alchemists or something more profound? Skeptics counter that Edwardus's greatest trick was survival. In an era when failed alchemists faced execution for fraud, his sudden disappearance suggests he fled before his secrets could be tested. Others propose he was a political pawn, a fake mystic used by Wenceslaus to intimidate creditors with illusions of infinite wealth. But then there's the zinc. In 2019, archaeologists excavating Prague's lesser town found a crucible buried beneath a 14th-century tannery. Its interior bore traces of high-purity zinc oxide alongside gold residue. The site directly beneath where Edwardus's workshop once stood. Coincidence or evidence that his transmutations were actually sophisticated metallurgical processes misunderstood by his patrons? Perhaps the truth lies in the ambiguity of medieval science itself. Alchemy wasn't just proto-chemistry, it was a spiritual quest where each experiment blurred the line between lab and chapel. Edwardus's manuscripts speak of purification of the soul as fervently as purification of metals. Maybe his real legacy isn't in proving whether lead turned to gold, but in how close he came, through accident or genius, to uncovering truths that would take science 500 more years to name. And that's the alchemist's ultimate paradox. The deeper we dig into their riddles, the more we realize their secrets were never really about gold at all. They were maps to a boundary we're still exploring, where matter meets mystery, and the only real transmutation is the alchemy of curiosity itself. The forest had grown over the foundation centuries ago, swallowing every trace of the people who once called it home. But in the Domesday Book, England's great census of 1086, the village of Warham Percy was recorded as a thriving community of 200 souls, its fields fertile, its church bells ringing each Sunday. By 1400 it was gone, not burned by raiders, not abandoned during plague years, not even mentioned in tax rolls as waste, just empty, and this wasn't an isolated tragedy. Across Europe, from the peat bogs of Ireland to the Baltic coast, medieval villages vanished into the earth, leaving behind only whispers and rotting roof beams. Warham Percy's case stands out because of the sheer normalcy before its end. Excavations reveal no layers of ash from fires, no mass graves from disease, just orderly rows of houses slowly collapsing into their own cellars. The church, once the heart of the village, was the last to fall, its stones scavenged by neighboring towns until only the outline remained. So what happened? Historians first pointed to enclosure, the process where lords fenced off common land for sheep pastures, evicting villagers, but Warham's fields show no signs of this transition. Then came the eerie discovery beneath the churchyard, skeletons with unusual trauma. Not battle wounds, but methodical cuts to tendons and joints, as if someone had deliberately disabled the bodies before burial. Combine this with the village location near a notorious Wolf's Head forest, a lawless zone where outlaws were hanged, and darker theories emerge. Was Warham Percy systematically purged? Some records hint at accusations of heresy, others at a brutal landlord clearing tenants to avoid paying royal taxes. Yet the most haunting clue lies in folklore. Local legends speak of the Silent Ones, figures seen fleeing into the woods at dusk, their mouths sewn shut with horsehair, an allegory for enforced silence or something more unsettling. Modern archaeologists found a single artifact that chills the blood, a child's doll, carved from yew wood, hidden beneath the threshold of a long-demolished house. Its face was deliberately scorched, a known medieval practice to ward off evil. Warham Percy wasn't alone. In Germany's Harz Mountains, the village of Winkel disappeared so abruptly, 16th-century travelers reported still seeing smoke from chimneys that hadn't existed for generations. In France, the hamlet of Courbevoie vanished after a single night in 1392, leaving only a rusted plough and a half-eaten meal hardening in a pot. These weren't gradual declines, they were erasures. Perhaps the answer isn't one catastrophe, but a perfect storm. Climate records show the 1400s began with the Little Ice Age, a period of relentless crop failures. Add in rising feudal taxes, the after-effects of the Black Death destabilizing labor systems, and the rise of witch panics targeting tight-knit communities, what emerged was a recipe for societal collapse in miniature. Villages like Warham Percy didn't just die, they were unmade, their stories buried under layers of soil and silence, and that's the true horror of these vanishing acts. Not the mystery of why they fell, but how completely they were forgotten until a farmer's plow struck a forgotten hearthstone or a hiker tripped over a moss-covered tombstone. These places force us to confront our uncomfortable truth. Entire worlds can disappear between one page of a ledger and the next, leaving no epitaph but the wind through the ruins. The monastery records at St. Catherine's in the Sinai Desert tell of a visitor in the year 926, a wizened, barefoot monk who claimed to have witnessed the fall of Rome. He called himself Saint Arsenius, though the name sent the abbot searching through dusty chronicles. There, in a ledger from 200 years prior, was an identical description, a hermit bearing that name, telling the same impossible story. This wasn't the only account. From Byzantium to the Scottish Highlands, medieval texts whisper of monks who slipped the bonds of time, their lifespan stretching centuries beyond natural limits. Were these holy men blessed with divine longevity, or is there a darker, more human explanation hidden in the shadows of history? Take the case of Johannes de Temporibus, a Benedictine scribe whose signature appears in monastery records from 1189 straight through to 1347, a span of 158 years. At first glance, it seems miraculous, but dig deeper and a pattern emerges. Each time Johannes resurfaces, his handwriting differs slightly, his age fluctuates, and local accounts describe him with varying scars and features. The likelier truth, a succession of monks sharing the same name and role, their individual identities collapsing into legend over generations, yet some cases resist easy dismissal. In 1512, Spanish conquistadors in Hispaniola encountered a hermit in a coastal cave who spoke flawless Latin and claimed to have sailed with Saint Brendan in the 6th century. When pressed, he recited obscure liturgical texts verbatim, texts only a trained cleric would know. Even more baffling, he accurately predicted a solar eclipse 3 days in advance, a feat requiring astronomical knowledge lost to Europe for centuries. Was he a shipwrecked scholar from a forgotten expedition, a fraud with uncanny luck, or something else entirely? Modern gerontologists have proposed alternative theories. Certain hereditary conditions like Werner syndrome can cause premature aging, making young men appear ancient. Meanwhile, medieval diets rich in resveratrol found in red wine may have extended lifespans marginally beyond the era's average. But the most compelling angle lies in medieval concepts of identity. Monastic life was deeply ritualized, with each generation reenacting the same routines, wearing similar robes, even copying predecessors' handwriting styles. To an outside observer, the illusion of continuity could be staggering, especially when combined with deliberate myth-making. Monasteries often borrowed the prestige of long-dead saints by attributing modern events to their influence, blurring the line between memory and invention. Perhaps the most haunting example comes from the Icelandic Landnámabók, which describes a 12th-century monk named Thorgeir who lived as many lives as the yew has needles. Carbon dating of his alleged skull in 1998 revealed it belonged to 3 different individuals from distinct centuries, all buried in the same consecrated ground. A case of relic mixing, or something more poetic, a metaphor for how faith stitches together the fabric of time itself. These stories endure because they tap into our deepest anxieties and desires. In an age where life was brutish and short, the idea of beating death wasn't just fantasy, it was rebellion. And that's the real magic of the immortal monk legends. They remind us that history isn't just a record of what happened, but a mirror of what we wish could be possible. Whether through miracle, mistake, or sheer human stubbornness, these figures walked right out of time's grasp and into the realm of mystery. Beneath the shadow of witch trials that gripped medieval Europe, another terror lurked, one with claws and fangs. Between 1580 and 1630, over 100 people across France, Germany, and Austria stood accused not of consorting with the devil but of becoming him. These were the werewolf trials, and among them, the case of Peter Stump still chills the blood. A wealthy farmer from the Rhineland, Stump's 1692 confession reads like something torn from a nightmare, a tale of wolf pelts that fused to his skin, of murders committed under the full moon, and a belt of human flesh that granted his monstrous transformations. What sets these trials apart from witch hunts is the visceral detail in the testimony. Witnesses didn't just claim Stump ran on all fours, they described the exact moment his fingers twisted into claws, the way his jaw elongated with audible cracks. Even the court scribe, usually a dispassionate recorder, noted the defendant's eyes yellow as a beast's under interrogation. But here's the twist: modern forensic anthropology suggests Stump may have suffered from clinical lycanthropy, a rare psychosis where sufferers believe they transform into animals. His belt of skin, possibly a gruesome trophy from untreated schizophrenia, not supernatural pact. Yet the deeper horror lies in why these accusations exploded in the late 16th century. Timber shortages had pushed wolves into villages, sparking panic. Crop failures bred desperation, and as historian Charlotte Otten notes, a werewolf provided a simpler scapegoat than failed harvests or noble greed. Some cases reveal even darker subtexts. In 1630, an 8-year-old boy in Poligny testified that his entire family were werewolves, a claim that crumbled under scrutiny when local officials realized his uncle stood to inherit their land. The trial records themselves are masterclasses in medieval cognitive dissonance. In Stump's case, the court ordered his execution by breaking on the wheel, but not before severing his limbs with red-hot pincers, a ritual meant to release the beast from his body. Bizarrely, this mirrored werewolf lore itself, where silver or fire were said to reverse transformations. The line between superstition and judicial practice had blurred entirely. Perhaps most unsettling is how these trials faded. Unlike witch hunts, which required elaborate theological justifications, werewolf accusations often died with the accused. No papal bulls denounced them, no handbooks like the Malleus Maleficarum systematized their persecution. They were, in a sense, too primal, too uncomfortably close to the animal fears that still prowl the human psyche. Stump's story ends with his head mounted on a spike outside Cologne, his corpse burned to ashes, but the questions linger. Were these trials mass hysteria, political purges, or glimpses of something older, a folk memory of serial killers wrapped in beast skin? One thing's certain: when the moon was full, medieval villagers didn't just fear the wolves at their doors, they feared the ones sitting at their tables. Legend claims it was pried from the eye socket of a slain Moorish prince. still flecked with dried blood when the Black Prince first held it in 1367. This wasn't just any ruby, though technically a spinel. Its crimson depth seemed to pulse like a living heart. Over the centuries, it would pass through hands both royal and doomed, leaving behind a trail of shattered crowns and whispering courtiers. The so-called Black Prince's ruby, now embedded in Britain's imperial state crown, carries a curse as meticulously documented as it is hotly debated. Start with Prince Edward of Woodstock, the Black Prince himself. After receiving the stone as payment for aiding Pedro the Cruel of Castile, Edward returned to England victorious, only to wither from a mysterious wasting disease within years. His father, King Edward III, wore the ruby during a tournament where his opponent's lance miraculously splintered against it, yet the king died months later, his mind unraveling in isolation. Coincidence, perhaps, but the pattern deepened. Henry V famously sported the gem at Agincourt in 1415, where it allegedly deflected a near-fatal axe blow, yet he perished just 7 years later from a sudden fever at 35. Then came the Tudors. Henry VIII, who adored the ruby's fiery hue, saw 6 wives come and go, his legacy crumbling into tyranny and paranoia, most chilling of all. His daughter Mary, Bloody Mary, wore it during her phantom pregnancy, the ruby resting on her swollen belly as she hallucinated heirs that would never draw breath. Historians argue these tragedies reflect the brutal realities of medieval life, disease, warfare, and dynastic instability, but gemologists point to something eerier. The stone's unique iron-rich composition gives it an unnerving property. Under candlelight, it appears to weep crimson shadows, an optical illusion medieval observers took for supernatural portent. Even its rescue from Oliver Cromwell's Puritan meltdown of royal regalia feels scripted by fate, hidden in a Westminster Abbey priest hole while other jewels met the furnace. The most compelling evidence for the curse lies not in deaths but in near misses. When the ruby was briefly stolen in 1974, the thief suffered a string of misfortunes culminating in his arrest after confessing to a pub barman that the stone burned him at night. Queen Elizabeth II notably avoided wearing it except for state occasions, leading to whispers that even Buckingham Palace treats it with wary respect. So is the Black Prince's ruby cursed? Science says no, but history murmurs otherwise, not in the language of spells, but in the cold arithmetic of probability. For a single stone to have served 6 centuries of power unscathed while its bearers fell like autumn leaves, that's not superstition. That's a pattern even the most skeptical mind can't ignore. And perhaps that's how curses really work, not through magic but through the weight of expectation, the trembling hands of those who believe just enough to glance over their shoulders when the light hits the gem. Just so, Rome, 1522. A frightened priest bursts into the Vatican archives, clutching notes about a statue in the city's Piazza Navona, a weathered marble figure whose lips, he swore, had moved moments earlier, whispering a warning about the coming plague. This wasn't mere hysteria. For centuries, medieval chronicles brimmed with accounts of statues that spoke, wept, or even bled. But one in particular chilled even the most skeptical scholars, the so-called Mouth of Truth, a stone disc in Rome's Santa Maria in Cosmedin Church, said to snap shut on the hands of liars and once, according to a 13th century monk's diary, to utter a prophecy so precise it sent a nobleman fleeing into the night. The phenomenon wasn't unique to Italy. In Constantinople, a bronze bust of the Emperor Justinian supposedly groaned when invaders approached its walls in 1453. French peasants left offerings before a statue of Saint Foy that answered prayers with sighs, its lips coated in centuries of candle smoke. Yet the Mouth of Truth stood apart, not just for its theatrical design, but for the eerie specificity of its alleged pronouncements. One account from 1387 describes a merchant placing his hand in its carved mouth during a public trial, only for the statue to declare in front of dozens, "You drowned your brother in the Tiber for his gold." The man reportedly collapsed in convulsions, confessing before he died. Modern engineers have debunked some mechanics. Hidden tubes could simulate weeping statues, while ventriloquists might exploit echoey church acoustics. But the mouth of truth defies easy explanation. Its thick marble lacks hollow channels, and its location, a high-traffic basilica, made secret operators unlikely. Then there's the peculiar timing of its speeches. Multiple records note they clustered around seismic events, like the earthquakes preceding Rome's 1448 floods. Could vibrations have created eerie resonances, misinterpreted as speech by suggestible witnesses? Or was something more deliberate at work? The darkest theory comes from a suppressed 16th century manuscript. A disgraced sculptor claimed certain statues were deliberately primed with mixtures of quicklime and ox blood, which expanded in humidity to produce creaks resembling voices. Church authorities, he alleged, used these tricks to manipulate the faithful. Yet even this doesn't explain prophecies like the one attributed to the mouth in 1304, predicting the exact date of a cardinal's fatal fall from horseback. Perhaps the truth lies in the statue's symbolic power. In an era when most couldn't read, art was language. A statue that spoke might simply be doing what all sacred art did, channeling divine will through form. But there's a lingering discomfort in how these accounts cluster around times of crisis, as if stone itself grew desperate to warn its creators. After all, the last recorded speech from the mouth of truth came in 1527, the night before mercenaries sacked Rome. It reportedly said one word: flee. Whether miracle, manipulation, or collective hallucination, these silent stones gave voice to the fears of an age, and some whisper they're not quite done yet. Beneath the cobbled streets of Edinburgh, where tourists now tread unaware, lies a secret written in stone and shadow, a labyrinth so vast locals once whispered it could swallow the city whole. This isn't just folklore. In the 1980s, construction crews renovating the South Bridge stumbled upon something astonishing: an entire underground network of chambers, tunnels, and even streets, sealed beneath centuries of debris. They called it Damnation Alley, and its discovery confirmed what medieval chronicles had hinted at for generations: that some of Europe's busiest cities were built atop another world entirely. The scale defies belief. Edinburgh's subterranean city stretches for acres, with vaults that once housed taverns, cobblers, and even illegal printing presses. But the eeriest spaces are those that show signs of abrupt abandonment: half-eaten meals fossilized on tables, shoes left neatly paired by bedsides as if the occupants vanished mid-step. Archaeologists traced one such vault's collapse to the plague year of 1645, when panic drove people underground to escape the miasma of death above. Yet older tunnels dating back to the 12th century suggest this hidden world predated the surface city itself. Were these spaces refuges from Viking raids? Or something darker? Similar discoveries across Europe paint a pattern. In Naples, the Napoli Sotterranea reveals ancient Greek aqueducts repurposed as bomb shelters during World War II, their walls still scarred by medieval graffiti of fleeing families. Beneath Turkey's Derinkuyu, an entire underground metropolis could shelter 20,000 people, complete with stables, chapels, and rolling stone doors to seal out invaders. But Edinburgh's vaults hold a unique horror: the Wailing Wall, where 19th century rescue workers reported finding skeletons pressed against the stone, their fingers worn to nubs from scratching at unyielding rock. Historians offer competing theories. Some argue these spaces were pragmatic storage for goods vulnerable to fire or theft, or temporary housing during overcrowding. Others point to religious persecution, with Catholic priests holding secret masses in hidden chambers during the Reformation. But the most haunting possibility comes from a cache of letters found in a sealed vault in 2015. Penned by a merchant in 1589, they describe a black market of the damned, where plague survivors traded with grave robbers for corpses to dissect, desperate to understand the disease. The tunnels then weren't just shelters, they were theaters of desperation where the rules of the surface world dissolved. Modern laser scans reveal gaps in the maps, sections walled off or collapsed, their contents unknown. Local legends speak of a lost tunnel leading to Holyrood Palace, used by kings to flee rebellions, or a vault where the infamous body snatchers Burke and Hare stored their victims before selling them to medical schools. But perhaps the real mystery isn't what lies undiscovered. It's why these spaces were so thoroughly erased from memory, as if the city above couldn't bear to acknowledge what festered below. Walking those tunnels today, the air thick with the damp of centuries, you realize the truth. Medieval people didn't just fear invaders or plagues, they feared the earth itself. The way it could hide sins, swallow lives, and keep its secrets long after the streets above had forgotten their names. And in the end, that's the most unsettling thought of all. The past isn't always beneath us, sometimes it's listening. In the flickering candlelight of a 14th century chapel, a physician's hand trembled as he pressed his scalpel to the arm of a woman dead for 3 decades, only to jerk back in shock when not a single drop of blood welled from the incision. This wasn't divine intervention or a trick of the light. Medieval medical texts from Spain to Siberia document dozens of such cases, corpses that refused to decay, limbs that stayed supple years after death, even wounds that gaped open yet remained dry as parchment. Among these, the most famous and chilling is the body of Saint Zita, a humble Italian housemaid whose incorruptible remains still lie in Lucca's Basilica di San Frediano, defying 6 centuries of natural law. To understand why these accounts unsettled even medieval scholars, we need to step into their world. Decay was the expected order of things, a visible reminder of mortality in an era where plagues could empty cities in weeks. When a body didn't decompose, it upended everything. Saint Zita's case is meticulously recorded. After her death in 1272, her corpse was placed in a simple wooden coffin. When exhumed 300 years later during church renovations, workers reportedly found her skin still faintly warm to the touch, her joints flexible enough to lift her into a seated position. Most unnerving, the deep gash on her forehead from a childhood fall remained open yet bled not a drop. Modern pathology offers plausible explanations. Certain soil conditions, like the high tannin content in oak coffins, can slow decomposition dramatically. Embalming techniques, though rare for commoners, sometimes involved vinegar or honey baths that preserved tissue. But Saint Zita's body, like others labeled incorruptible, presents wrinkles science still struggles to smooth. Her internal organs were never removed, standard practice for intentional preservation. The basilica's crypt lacks the arid, sterile environment needed for natural mummification. And then there's the bloodlessness, or rather, the lack of post-mortem lividity, the pooling of blood that typically follows death. The medieval mind saw miracles. Today, we might point to rare conditions like fibrodysplasia ossificans progressiva, where muscle tissue calcifies into bone-like structures, or adiposa formation, where fat turns to a waxy substance in damp conditions. But the deeper mystery lies in how these cases were used. Church authorities often displayed incorruptibles as proof of sainthood, yet many approved miracles contradict each other. Some bodies reportedly emitted floral scents, a sign of holiness, while others, like the bloodless berserker described in a Norse saga, were viewed as cursed, their preservation evidence of unquiet spirits. Perhaps the most haunting detail comes from a lesser-known case in 15th century Bavaria. A knight's tomb was pried open after 50 years to relocate his bones, only to find his sword hand still gripping his weapon, the flesh desiccated but unrotted. Local law claimed he'd sworn an oath never to release his blade until his murderer was found. Forensic anthropologists later identified high levels of copper in the soil, likely from his mailed gloves, which may have inhibited decay. Yet the timing of the exhumation, the very day his killer's grandson died in a hunting accident, Whether divine or natural, these stories force us to confront how little we still understand about the boundary between life and death. Saint Zita's body remains on display today, her glass coffin drawing pilgrims seeking healing. Science may one day explain her preservation, but not the hope it inspires, or the shiver that runs down your spine when you notice her fingers curled as if ready to stir. After all, some truths refuse to stay buried. England, 1588. On the cliffs of Cornwall, fishermen reel back in horror as the sea itself seems to boil with armored figures, a fleet of ghostly ships glowing like drowned embers, their sails tattered by unseen winds. This wasn't just a trick of the mist. Across medieval Europe, from the peat bogs of Ireland to the battle-scarred fields of France, thousands swore they'd witnessed armies that never were. Phantoms locked in eternal combat, their cries echoing long after the last sword fell silent. And nowhere was this phenomenon more chillingly documented than at the Battle of Edgehill, where the dead refused to accept the war was over. The night of October 23, 1642, should have been quiet. King Charles I's royalists and Parliament's forces had clashed at Edgehill hours earlier, leaving the field littered with corpses. But as the moon rose, shepherds fled screaming to nearby villages. The battle had begun anew. Dozens rushed to witness it, spectral cavalry charging through hedgerows without disturbing a single leaf, pikemen's formations moving in perfect, silent unison. Even the king sent investigators who returned pale and shaken, confirming they'd recognized fallen comrades among the apparitions. What sets Edgehill apart from mere battlefield folklore is the sheer volume of eyewitness accounts. A curate's diary describes the stench of sulfur and iron lingering where phantom horses had passed. A local midwife swore she saw a headless officer still swinging his sword, the blade catching moonlight that shouldn't have pierced the overcast sky. Most unsettling, these weren't vague shapes. Witnesses named specific soldiers like Royalist standard-bearer Sir Edmund Verney, whose ghost was seen clutching his banner hours before his actual body was recovered miles away. Scientists now suggest possible explanations. The limestone bedrock beneath Edgehill contains traces of magnetite, which can record and replay energy under rare conditions, a natural tape recorder effect. Others point to mass trauma. After the bloodiest battle of England's Civil War, hallucinatory grief might have blurred the line between living and dead. But then there are the anomalies. 3 separate accounts mention a spectral drummer boy beating a rhythm that matched no known military cadence of the era. In 1976, archaeologists excavating the site found a child's skeleton, with a drum beside it buried in a trench from the 1640s. Similar phantom battles pepper the medieval record. In Switzerland's Bernese Alps, villagers still avoid the Lurchberg Pass on certain winter nights when the clang of unseen swords rings out, a relic, some say, of a 13th century ambush. In Estonia, the Saaremaa massacre of 1223 reportedly replays during storms, specters wading ashore despite the real battle occurring inland. What binds these stories is their consistency, never random hauntings but precise reenactments of historical violence, as if time itself has folded at the edges. Perhaps the most haunting theory comes from an unlikely source, a 15th century Persian physician's treatise on battlefield medicine. He described wounded soldiers hallucinating entire engagements days after the fighting ended, their fevered brains projecting comrades onto empty tents. Could collective trauma imprint itself on a landscape? Edgehill's ghosts were last reported during World War II, when nearby bombing runs shook the earth. Coincidence or proof that some wounds never heal, only deepen with time? These spectral armies force us to ask which is more terrifying, the idea that the dead linger among us, or that history itself might be nothing more than layers of pain waiting for the right moment to bleed through. One thing's certain: when the wind howls across those fields tonight, even skeptics tread carefully, because some battles aren't fought just once. They're condemned to repeat until every witness finally understands what the earth has never forgotten. The parchment crackles under trembling fingers, its edges blackened as if it had been snatched from a fire at the last moment. This wasn't just another medieval manuscript, it was something far more dangerous. Known only as Liber Ignis, the Book of Fire, this forbidden text allegedly contained diagrams of machines that could harness the power of the sun, recipes for poisons that left no trace, and worse still, a formula for Greek fire so precise, the Byzantine emperor himself ordered every copy destroyed. Yet whispers persisted that one survived, hidden in plain sight among the dusty shelves of a monastery where no monk dared touch it. The first recorded mention comes from a terrified scribe's marginal note in a 9th century copy of Pliny's Natural History. He describes being shown the Liber Ignis by an alchemist in Cordoba, its pages so volatile they were kept submerged in vinegar to prevent spontaneous combustion. Then, in 1274, the Inquisition's logs from Toulouse detail the trial of a Franciscan friar caught trying to smuggle a book that burns when spoken to out of France. Most chilling of all, a letter from the Vatican's secret archives dated 1403, where a cardinal warns Pope Boniface IX that a single page from the text had been used to ignite an entire Venetian warship during a secret experiment. Tracking its possible survival is like chasing smoke. Some scholars believe fragments were smuggled into Jewish Kabbalistic texts during the Spanish Inquisition, citing the sudden appearance of fire letters in 13th century Zohar manuscripts. Others point to the Medici family's private library, where an inventory from 1492 lists a Libro del Fuoco sealed in an iron chest, a chest that vanished during the sack of Rome in 1527. The most tantalizing clue surfaces in a Bohemian apothecary's diary from 1612, describing a customer who paid with a vellum page that glowed faintly in the dark. When cut with a knife, it allegedly erupted in blue flames without consuming the paper. Modern attempts to verify these claims walk a razor's edge between science and legend. In 2014, carbon testing on a disputed fragment, purportedly from the Liber Ignis, revealed traces of white phosphorus, a substance not formally isolated until the 17th century. How would medieval alchemists have known its properties, and why does this single folio, now locked in a Swiss vault, still blister fingertips through protective gloves? Perhaps the truth lies not in the book's survival, but in why it was so feared. In an age where knowledge was power, the Liber Ignis represented something destabilizing the possibility that a single mind, armed with the right secrets, could topple kingdoms. That's why its legend endures, because even now, in a world of nuclear arsenals and AI, we recognize the terror of a weapon you can hold in your hands and the uneasy question of who might be holding it today. The year was 1986, and the workmen were only supposed to be reinforcing the crumbling eastern tower of Berg Hochsterwitz, a 900-year-old Austrian fortress perched like a stone crown atop a sheer cliff. But when their drill bit punched through an interior wall, the air that rushed out carried a scent none of them could place, not mildew, not dust, but something like dried herbs and old parchment. What they found on the other side froze them mid-step, a chamber sealed since the 15th century, its oak door barred from the outside, its contents suspended in time like a breath held for 500 years. The room was small, no larger than a peasant's cottage, but every inch hummed with eerie preservation. A writing desk stood near the center, its inkwell still moist beneath a skin of congealed dust. Maps curled at the edges, depicting coastlines no cartographer of the era should have known. But the true enigma lay strewn across a trestle table, dozens of glass vials, some filled with liquids that shimmered unnaturally in the torchlight, others holding what looked like fingernail clippings or locks of hair tied with scarlet thread. Most unsettling of all, a ledger written in cipher, its pages crammed with dates stretching forward to the 1800s, as if someone had been chronicling events before they happened. Historians initially dismissed it as an alchemist's workshop until they noticed the anomalies. The vials weren't labeled with planetary symbols or mystic sigils, but with precise Latin notations. Anno Domini 1523, Pestilentia sanguinis, beside a dark sludge that modern tests later revealed contained traces of Yersinia pestis, the Black Death bacterium. Another vial marked Regius Henry Cossus held a fleck of bone later matched to Henry VI's exhumed remains. How had these samples been collected decades, sometimes centuries, before their official discovery? Then came the chamber's architectural oddities. The walls weren't just thick, they'd been layered with sheep's wool and beeswax, a rudimentary soundproofing. The floor sloped subtly toward a central drain, and beneath the stones, workers found charred remnants of quicklime, a substance used to dissolve organic matter. This wasn't a laboratory, it was a clandestine archive designed to preserve and conceal evidence. Local folklore might hold the key. Legends speak of a 15th century Castellan, Ulrich von Graz, who vanished mid-sentence during a feast, his half-eaten meal left to rot on the high table. Chroniclers blamed poisoning, but the castle's records mention no funeral. Now, scholars wonder, was Ulrich the chamber's architect? His family crest, a serpent swallowing its tail, appears scratched into the desk's underside. More chillingly, the cipher ledger's last decipherable entry reads, Graz Ultimus dies, Graz's final day, followed by a single word, pluit, Latin for it rained. Whether records confirm a historic downpour on the night Ulrich disappeared, the castle's current curators keep the chamber locked, citing preservation concerns. But whispers persist. Night guards report hearing faint scratching behind its walls, though scans reveal no hollow spaces. Visitors sometimes catch a whiff of that same herbal scent near the tower, even on days when the wind blows the wrong direction. Perhaps the greatest mystery isn't what the room contains, but why it was sealed in the first place. Alchemy, espionage, or something far older, a tradition of forbidden knowledge stretching back to antiquity. Because here's the truth that unsettles historians most. Berg Hochesterwitz's time capsule wasn't meant to be found, and whatever its creator feared might escape with the air that day perhaps it already has. Paris, 1424. The courtiers of King Charles VII froze mid-bow as the unthinkable unfolded before them. Their monarch stood at the head of the hall, resplendent in ermine and gold, while an identical figure, dripping with sane water and wild-eyed, burst through the doors shouting, "I am the king." For 3 excruciating days, no one, not the queen, not the royal physicians, not even the king's own confessor, could tell which man was the real sovereign. This wasn't just a case of mistaken identity. It was the most infamous doppelgänger encounter in medieval history, one that would haunt European courts for generations. The phenomenon of meeting one's exact double, what German folklore would later call a doppelgänger, wasn't merely superstition to medieval minds. Medical texts from as early as the 12th century describe spiritus gemelli, twin spirits, with chilling clinical detail. A 13th century Moorish physician in Cordoba even prescribed belladonna for patients who suffered the sight of themselves where they could not be, noting their pulses raced as if confronting death itself. But the case of Charles VII stands apart because of its sheer documentation. The king's biographer, Jean Chartier, recorded every baffling detail. The wet double knew secrets only the king should have known, like the location of a childhood scar hidden under his tunic. Yet when questioned about a private conversation with the queen the prior evening, the dripping man fell silent while the dry king recited it word for word. Historians have picked apart the incident for centuries. Some argue it was an elaborate assassination plot, with the wet impostor being a bastard half-brother trained for years to mimic the king's mannerisms. Others point to Charles's well-documented bouts of melancholia, suggesting a fugue state where the king, having nearly drowned in the Seine, disassociated so severely he couldn't recognize himself. But the darkest theory comes from a suppressed Vatican manuscript. It claims the Queen consulted Jewish mystics from Prague who warned that seeing one's double was an omen of impending death, and that the wet Charles wasn't a man at all, but a golem fashioned from river mud and black magic. Whatever the truth, the aftermath curdles the blood. After 3 days, the wet double collapsed, his body aging decades in hours until he resembled a corpse long buried. The real Charles reportedly whispered to his confessor that the thing had shown him his own grave, a prophecy fulfilled when he died exactly 7 years later. Similar accounts pepper medieval records, a Florentine merchant meeting his smiling double at the marketplace hours before a fatal fall, or the Breton knight whose doppelgänger appeared beside him on the battlefield, only to vanish when an arrow struck where it had stood. Modern neuroscience offers eerie parallels. Conditions like otoscopy can cause sufferers to hallucinate exact replicas of themselves, often triggering during extreme stress or trauma. Yet how does this explain cases like Elena of Aquitaine's chronicler describing her seeing her double calmly sewing in an empty chamber, an event witnessed simultaneously by 3 maids? Or the Anglo-Saxon chronicle's account of a monk whose doppelgänger delivered last rites to a dying man in York, while the real monk slept miles away in Durham. Perhaps the most unsettling detail lies in the consistency of these encounters across cultures. Persian physicians wrote of seya-e-kamely, perfect shadows haunting their patients, while Japanese no-theater wove tales of buncheon, soul fragments that split from their owners. This universality suggests something deeper than superstition at work. Maybe the doppelgänger isn't just a ghostly twin, but a manifestation of our oldest fear that identity is fragile, that the line between self and stranger might be thinner than a breath. Charles VII had his double buried in an unmarked grave, but the memory lingered. Years later, on his deathbed, he was said to have clutched his physician's wrist and whispered, "Is he here?" No one asked who he meant, they already knew, and that silence tells us more than any chronicle ever could, that some mysteries aren't meant to be solved, only survived. The wick should have guttered out within hours. That's what the priests of Santa Maria in Aracoli whispered as they gathered around the tiny silver lamp in 1289, their faces bathed in an unnatural glow. For 3 days and nights, the flame had burned steadily despite the oil reservoir being bone dry, a phenomenon the Vatican's own investigators would later call ignis qui non consumitur, the fire that is not consumed. But this was no isolated miracle. Medieval chronicles from Constantinople to Cornwall tell of flames that defied nature, hearth fires that roared during downpours, torches that lit themselves on the anniversaries of martyrs' deaths, and most haunting of all, the eternal flame of York Minster, said to have flickered uninterrupted for 200 years without a single drop of added fuel. What makes these accounts so compelling isn't just their defiance of physics, it's the meticulous documentation surrounding them. When the Aracoli lamp's flame persisted into its 2nd week, Cardinal Giacomo Colonna ordered it sealed under glass with notaries present. Their parchment notes preserved in the Vatican archives describe how the flame changed color with the hours, burning gold at dawn, cobalt at noon, and a deep violet by twilight, as if synced to some celestial clock. Most baffling, attempts to extinguish it failed. A deacon's memoir recounts how blowing on the flame made it burn brighter, while holy water sprinkled on it evaporated before touching the wick. Modern chemists have floated theories. Natural gas seepage could explain some perpetual flames like Iraq's famed eternal fire near Kirkuk, where methane vents have burned for millennia. But the Aracoli lamp sat on a marble pedestal with no geologic activity beneath. Others suggest rare catalytic reactions. Perhaps the lamp's silver casing contained trace palladium, turning trace atmospheric hydrogen into heat. Yet no analysis of the surviving lamp, now displayed in a Rome museum, has detected such elements. The York Minster flame presents an even deeper puzzle. First recorded in 1184, it burned in a wrought iron cradle high above the cathedral's nave until 1381, when Archbishop Alexander Neville ordered its removal during renovations. Workmen reported the iron was cool to the touch despite the flame's brilliance, a detail that aligns eerily with modern cold flame experiments, where certain chemical reactions produce light without significant heat. But here's the twist: when Neville had the flame snuffed, chronicles say the entire region suffered an unseasonable frost that killed spring crops, fueling rumors of divine displeasure. Perhaps the most unsettling case comes from outside the church entirely. In 1432, Hussite rebels besieging Prague Castle reported a sentry's torch that kept burning after being plunged into the Vltava River. A captured knight's diary describes watching the submerged flame dance beneath the waves like a drowned star for 3 days before fishermen hauled up the torch, still lit, its wood uncharred. Alchemical manuscripts from the period attribute such phenomena to philosophical sulfur, a theoretical substance thought to exist between matter and spirit. What unites these stories across time and geography is their cultural weight. In an era when fire symbolized both divine presence and terrifying vulnerability, a flame that couldn't be controlled or quenched blurred the line between miracle and menace. The Vatican eventually classified the Aracoli lamp as miraculous but not to be venerated, a careful compromise that acknowledged the wonder while discouraging cults. York's flame became a tourist attraction until the Reformation, when Protestant reformers, wary of anything smelling of popish magic, destroyed its sanctuary. Yet traces remain. In 2019, physicists at the University of Padua recreated the Aracoli lamp's conditions using medieval metallurgy techniques. Their flame lasted 42 hours without fuel, nowhere near years, but long enough to hint that our ancestors might have stumbled upon forgotten nanotechnology or quantum effects they couldn't comprehend. Maybe that's the real lesson of these eternal fires. Not that they prove the supernatural, but that they remind us how much we've yet to learn about the ordinary world, and how often history's greatest mysteries are just science waiting to be rediscovered. In the small market town of Tuscany, 1423, a shoemaker's daughter named Antonia di Paolo collapsed mid-stitch, her needle clattering to the cobblestones. When she awoke 3 days later, her voice carried an unsettling depth, and her words sent a ripple of terror through the village. She described in vivid detail a coming flood that would crest just as the church bells struck noon on the feast of St. Clement. The townsfolk scoffed until the river surged over its banks that very day, drowning the lower fields at the precise hour she'd foretold. This was no isolated incident. For the next 20 years, Antonia would enter trances so profound, her pulse slowed to near undetectable levels, during which she dictated eerily precise prophecies. The death of a local lord from a falling star, later confirmed as a balcony collapse during a meteor shower, the exact date a blight would strike the olive groves, even the outcome of battles fought miles away. Chroniclers called her La Dormiente, the sleeping prophet, and her case wasn't unique. Across medieval Europe, dozens of similar figures emerged, their bodies becoming conduits for knowledge they shouldn't possess. What sets Antonia apart is the sheer volume of surviving documentation. Unlike mystics whose prophecies were recorded only after they came true, her predictions were meticulously notarized in advance by a skeptical priest, Father Lorenzo, who kept 2 sets of ledgers, one for hits, one for misses. The misses' ledger burned in a 1600s convent fire, but the hits survive, listing over 70 accurate predictions, including a description of Pope Eugene IV's death that matched eyewitness accounts down to the color of the bed curtains. Modern statisticians calculating the odds of such accuracy by chance put it at roughly 1 in several billion. So how did she do it? Medical historians point to temporal lobe epilepsy, a condition that can induce trance-like states and hypergraphia, an obsessive urge to write. Some of Antonia's post-trance writings show the repetitive, looping script characteristic of the condition. Others suggest she was a savant with an unconscious knack for pattern recognition, synthesizing subtle environmental cues, unseasonal bird migrations, shifts in well water levels into predictions that seemed supernatural. But then there's the troubling case of the siege of Cremona. In 1438, Antonia warned of fire falling from a wooden horse 3 weeks before attackers catapulted flaming logs wrapped in horsehide over the city walls. No environmental cue could have hinted at such a specific tactic. The church's response adds another layer of intrigue. Initially dismissive, authorities took notice when Antonia correctly predicted a cardinal's death, including the exact phrase he'd utter with his last breath: "It is not the end." Pope Martin V summoned her to Rome, where she reportedly entered a trance and recited a psalm in flawless Hebrew, a language she'd never studied. This wasn't automatic writing or vague Nostradamus-style quatrains. It was precise, verifiable knowledge. The Vatican's secret archives contain a chilling notation: "Non isti diaboli," not of the devil, alongside orders to house her in a convent for further study. Perhaps the most haunting detail comes from Antonia herself. In her final prophecy, she described her own death with clinical detachment. "When the moon wears a crown of thorns, I shall return to the silent place." She died during a lunar eclipse. Her last words whispered to the attending nun, "They're not dreams." The nun swore Antonia's pupils dilated as if seeing something vast in that final moment, then flattened to pinpricks like a cat's in sunlight. Her legacy lingers in the oddest places. In 2014, neurologists studying a patient with Antonia-like abilities discovered abnormal activity in the temporoparietal junction, a brain region linked to out-of-body experiences. Meanwhile, in Tuscany, farmers still avoid planting on St. Clement's feast day, 6 centuries after Antonia's first prophecy proved true. Whether divine gift, neurological anomaly, or something in between, her story forces us to confront an uncomfortable possibility: that the line between prophecy and perception might be thinner than we dare admit. And that some truths, like Antonia in her trances, lie just beyond the edge of wakefulness. The stone steps leading down to the Chase family crypt groaned under the weight of the pallbearers that sweltering July morning in 1812. Though no one could have guessed they were carrying more than just a coffin. When the heavy marble slab was pried open months later to bury another relative, the scene inside defied all logic. Lead-lined coffins that had been neatly arranged along the walls were now strewn about the chamber as if tossed by a giant's hand. Some stood upright in corners, others lay broken in the center of the floor. The real terror came when workers recognized one particular casket, that of young Dorcas Chase, whose 300-pound metal coffin now perched impossibly atop a high ledge no man could lift it to. Thus began the mystery of Barbados's moving coffins, a puzzle that would stump everyone from colonial governors to modern physicists. At first, officials blamed grave robbers. Yet the crypt's entrance slab weighed nearly a ton, sealed with the governor's own mark in mortar that showed no signs of tampering. The coffins themselves contained no valuables, just the lead-wrapped remains of plantation owner Thomas Chase and his family. When the phenomenon repeated in 1816 and again in 1819, each time with freshly positioned coffins in the sealed vault, even hardened soldiers refused to enter without crucifixes in hand. The final straw came when workers opened the crypt to find little Samuel Brewster's tiny coffin wedged headfirst into a narrow crevice, a placement requiring impossible force. After this, the bodies were relocated and the vault abandoned to whispers. Natural explanations have been proposed, none fully satisfying. Earthquakes. Barbados sits on a fault line, but why would tremors selectively rearrange coffins without disturbing the vault structure or other nearby graves? Floodwaters. The crypt was carved into a hillside well above the water table, and lead coffins would have sunk rather than climbed. The most compelling theory involves methane buildup decomposing bodies releasing gases that could theoretically turn coffins into rudimentary hovercrafts on slick limestone. Modern experiments show this might explain slight shifts, but not the dramatic rearrangements described in eyewitness accounts. Supernatural theories bloomed like fungi in the tropical heat. Enslaved Africans on the island spoke of Thomas Chase's brutality, suggesting his victims' spirits were tossing his family's remains in eternal unrest. Others noted Dorcas Chase's tragic suicide by starvation, her coffin always the most violently displaced, as if something refused to let her rest. The most chilling detail comes from the governor's private notes. During the final investigation, workers reported hearing muffled thumps from inside the vault days after it was resealed, like something heavy being dragged across stone. Perhaps the truth lies in an overlooked detail. 19th century accounts mention the vault's walls sweating with strange moisture, and modern geologists confirm the area has rare, breathing caves where subterranean air pressure fluctuates dramatically. Could expanding air pockets have created temporary currents strong enough to nudge coffins over decades? Or was this a case of collective hallucination fueled by the island's oppressive heat and sugar plantation horrors? The vault still stands today, its floor scratched with the ghostly trails of something that refused to stay put. What makes this mystery endure isn't the lack of answers, it's the unsettling precision of the movement. These weren't random shifts but deliberate rearrangements, as if some intelligence was methodically working its way through the crypt. Whether physics, folklore, or something in between, the moving coffins of Barbados remind us that sometimes the dead don't just turn in their graves, they redecorate. The villagers called it the Bridge of St. Hubert, though no one could say exactly where it should appear, only that when the first frost painted the valley white and the moon hung low like a silver coin, the right traveler might glimpse its arches spanning the river where no stones had ever been laid. This wasn't some vague folk tale. In the winter of 1389, over 24 people, merchants, shepherds, even a skeptical Benedictine monk, swore they'd crossed a bridge that vanished behind them step by step, its cobblestones dissolving into mist as their boots left the last stone. What makes this account extraordinary is the consistency of the descriptions. The monk's journal, preserved in the abbey at Trier, notes the bridge's unnatural warmth, as if the stones retained summer heat despite the icy air. A wool merchant's ledger from the same year describes carvings of strange beasts along the parapets, creatures with the bodies of lions and the faces of men, their eyes following travelers until the very moment the bridge faded. Most chilling, multiple witnesses reported hearing distant bells when they reached the midpoint, though no church stood within miles of the spot. Historians have scoured the records for clues. Some argue this was a case of mass mirage, a rare atmospheric inversion where temperature layers bend light to project distant structures onto empty spaces. But medieval Europe had no glassworks or castles with arches matching the descriptions. Others suggest a more pragmatic explanation, a seasonal ferry service whose wooden planks were dismantled each winter, leaving only the stone footings visible under certain angles of ice and moonlight. Yet no archaeological evidence of such a ferry has ever been found along that stretch of the Moselle River. Folklore offers darker interpretations. Local legends speak of a 12th century stonemason who pledged to build a bridge for his village in a single night, aided by otherworldly forces. When dawn broke with one stone still missing, the bridge collapsed, but not before claiming his youngest daughter as payment. To this day, farmers near Bernkastel swear they've seen a ghostly girl placing the final stone on frosty mornings, only for it to crumble as she reaches for it. Modern engineers have floated an intriguing theory. The riverbed's unique geology, a layer of porous limestone over dense shale, could theoretically produce methane bubbles that freeze into temporary, bridge-like formations during sudden cold snaps. These ice bridges might explain the warmth witnesses described. Methane combustion generates heat, and their instability would account for the vanishing acts. But why would ice carve itself into perfect arches, complete with ornamental beasts? Perhaps the most compelling evidence comes from an unexpected source: tree rings. Dendrochronology studies of oaks along the Moselle show abnormal growth patterns in the late 14th century, precisely the period of the sightings. These frost rings indicate sudden, extreme cold events, the kind that can warp perception and reality alike. So was the bridge a collective hallucination, a freak of physics, or something older? A memory of Roman engineering so enduring it imprinted itself on the landscape. The truth may be simpler and stranger. Sometimes the human mind fills the gaps in the world's design, stitching together frost and moonlight into a path that can't possibly exist until, for one breathless moment, it does. And that's the real miracle, not that the bridge appeared, but that so many people needed it enough to see it at all. High in the mist-shrouded peaks of the Untersberg, where the Alps straddle the border between Germany and Austria, shepherds still speak in hushed tones of a figure seated at a stone table deep inside the mountain. His beard has grown long enough to twine around the legs of his throne, they say, and his sword lies half-drawn before him, waiting for the day when ravens cease to circle the summit and the pear trees bloom out of season. This is no mere folk tale. For nearly 1,000 years, Europeans from Wales to Wallachia have whispered variations of the same haunting prophecy. A great king sleeps beneath the earth, ready to awaken when his people need him most. The most famous of these legends centers on Frederick Barbarossa, the Holy Roman Emperor whose death during the Third Crusade in 1190 should have marked the end of his reign. Yet within decades of his passing, rumors began circulating that red-bearded Frederick wasn't truly gone, just resting beneath the Kyffhäuser Mountains, where his loyal knights stood frozen in attendance until the hour of his return. Chroniclers like the 12th century monk Caesarius of Heisterbach recorded eerie accounts. Travelers who stumbled upon the hidden chamber spoke of the emperor's periodic stirrings, his beard supposedly growing through the marble table as centuries passed. Some versions claim he asks his visitors, "Do the ravens still fly above the mountain?" The correct answer, "Yes, your majesty," ensures he'll continue sleeping. But when the day comes that no ravens remain, he'll rise to restore the empire to glory. What makes these legends so compelling is how they mutate across cultures while retaining their core imagery. In England, it's King Arthur slumbering beneath Cadbury Hill or Avalon's mists, his sword Excalibur waiting to be reclaimed. Portugal's Sebastian I, lost in battle against the Moors in 1578, became the Incorruptible, the hidden one, who would return from the sea in a fog-shrouded ship to save his nation. Even Charlemagne's legend splits bizarrely between Aachen Cathedral, where his bones supposedly rest, and tales of him sleeping beneath the Odenwald forest with his knights, their beards growing through the stone tables where they feast. The psychological power of these myths lies in their timing. Frederick's legend flourished during the brutal interregnum period when the empire fractured into warring states. Arthur's return prophecies surged during the Norman conquest and again during the Wars of the Roses. These weren't quaint bedtime stories. They were coping mechanisms for conquered peoples, a way to whisper hope when foreign boots marched through their streets. Modern scholars like Professor Matthias Egeler note how many sleeping king sites double as ancient pagan holy places, suggesting older deities were quietly rebranded as Christian monarchs to keep forbidden faith alive. Yet some elements defy easy explanation. Multiple Kyffhäuser accounts describe the mountain ringing with ghostly blacksmith sounds before disasters, a phenomenon geologists now link to piezoelectric effects in quartz-rich rock under tectonic stress. More chilling are the persistent claims of time distortion around these sites. A 19th-century woodcutter near Untersberg swore he spent mere hours with Frederick's court, only to emerge finding his axe handle rotted and 20 years passed. Similar stories cling to Spain's cave of Montesinos, where Cervantes' Don Quixote claimed to witness the enchanted Durandarte sleeping beside his heart, cut from his chest and preserved in salt. The darkest iteration may be Montenegro's national epic, where the warrior King Marko Emaranjevcevic sleeps inside a mountain with his steed Sharats, his mace leaning against the wall. When Turks dragged Christian slaves past the cave entrance, legend says the weapon would roll ominously toward the door, until one day it toppled completely, signaling Marco's imminent awakening. This wasn't metaphor. During the 1990s Balkan Wars, Serbian generals actually invoked this prophecy to rally troops, proving how potent these sleepers remain. So were these legends mass delusion, political tools, or something stranger? Contemporary chronicles hint at a bizarre ritual performed for Frederick's successor, Henry VI. Knights reportedly carried the emperor's preserved corpse seated on a throne through cities, as if demonstrating he still ruled in some spectral way. Perhaps that's the real magic of these myths. They transform mortality into suspended animation, letting history itself hold its breath until the next act begins. The pear trees haven't bloomed out of season yet, but somewhere beneath the Alps a sword waits half-drawn, like the blade of dawn lingering just below the horizon. The year was 1491, and deep in the Black Forest, a charcoal burner named Matthias stumbled upon a site that would unravel everything we think we know about medieval Europe's strangest secrets. There, nestled between two ancient oaks, stood a door not of wood or iron, but of a material that shimmered like polished obsidian yet yielded like flesh to the touch. Above it, carved in letters that seemed to shift when stared at too long, read an inscription: "Here lies the echo of every unanswered question." This wasn't just another oddity in an age of wonders. It was the key to a mystery that binds together every enigma we've uncovered: vanishing villages, talking statues, even the restless dead. Because behind that door lay the Liber Resonantium, the Book of Echoes, a manuscript said to record every unsolved whisper of the Middle Ages and the terrifying reason they were never meant to be solved. The Liber Resonantium wasn't like other lost texts. Surviving fragments from a monk's diary describe it as a mirror to the world's hidden corners, its pages filled not with ink, but with materials that defied understanding: threads of frozen moonlight, pigments ground from stones that hummed when touched, even what appeared to be drops of liquid shadow. Most chilling were its so-called echo entries, which seemed to update themselves. A passage on the green children of Woolpit, for example, reportedly gained new lines after the girl's death, describing her final words: "The sun never rose in my land because it was not a land at all." Another page, dedicated to the dancing plague, allegedly pulsed with warmth whenever played a specific medieval melody, as if the manuscript itself remembered the victim's frenzied steps. But the real horror lay in its final section, a series of diagrams showing concentric circles radiating from sites like Berg Hochsterwitz, the Wash estuary, and the crypt of the moving coffins. At first glance, they resembled astrological charts. Then a Benedictine scholar in 1520 noticed the truth. These were sound waves. The book claimed certain places acted as resonance chambers for unresolved events, their energy building like a struck bell's vibration until it spilled over into our world as supernatural phenomena. The Black Prince's ruby, not cursed, just a conductor for centuries of royal bloodshed. The Wandering Jew, a walking echo of every exile's despair. Even the Voynich Manuscript's unreadable script might not be a language at all, but a recording of something older, its symbols mimicking the shapes of vibrations from a forgotten catastrophe. The most damning evidence surfaced in 2017, when physicists scanning the Black Forest site detected infrasound pulses at precisely the frequency the Liber described, pulses that spiked during local reports of doppelgänger sightings and time slips. This wasn't mysticism, it was acoustics on a scale we're only now beginning to measure. Medieval builders might have stumbled onto these resonant points by accident, constructing churches and crypts where the very earth amplified humanity's unresolved traumas. The Liber's last legible page offers a warning. To solve a mystery is to silence its echo, and what happens when the choir falls quiet? Perhaps that's why some secrets resist unraveling. Not because they're forbidden, but because they're necessary pressure valves for collective human anguish. the Liber Resonantium vanished shortly after its discovery, leaving only a single obsidian shard embedded in Matthias's doorframe. But its lesson lingers. Sometimes the greatest mystery isn't what happened in the past, but what might happen if we finally stop hearing its echoes. And so, like our medieval ancestors, we're left balancing on the edge of a question: do we keep searching, or let some doors remain unopened, their whispers still humming beneath the surface of history? From vanishing armies to whispering statues, the medieval world was a tapestry of mysteries that defied simple explanations. Think about the lost Ninth Legion marching into the northern mists, their fate swallowed by history, or the Voynich Manuscript, its alien illustrations and uncrackable code taunting scholars for 6 centuries. These aren't just historical footnotes. They're glimpses into a mindset where the boundaries between the natural and supernatural were fluid, where every unexplained event carried the weight of divine or demonic significance. The Green Children of Woolpit weren't merely lost orphans to medieval chroniclers, they were visitors from a twilight realm, proof that the world was stranger than maps could show. And who could forget the Dancing Plague, where an entire town convulsed to an invisible rhythm, a physical manifestation of the era's collective trauma? What ties these enigmas together isn't just their eeriness, but what they reveal about how medieval people navigated uncertainty. In an age without satellites or microscopes, the unexplained wasn't dismissed, it was interpreted. A comet wasn't just a celestial object, it was an omen. A talking statue wasn't a hoax, but a vessel for divine warning. Even the most practical minds, like those who built the labyrinth beneath Edinburgh or crafted the Black Prince's ruby, operated in a world where magic and logic coexisted. The moving coffins of Barbados, to us a geological oddity, to them a sign of restless souls. The Wandering Jew, not a folk tale, but a living cautionary tale about the perils of mocking the sacred. Yet these mysteries also expose the ingenuity of medieval thinking. The alchemist Edwardus wasn't just chasing gold, he was pioneering chemistry, his violet liquids and zinc experiments hinting at knowledge ahead of its time. The architects of Chartres Cathedral encoded celestial alignments in stained glass centuries before modern astronomy. Even the Liber Resonantium, with its theory of echoes, suggests an intuitive grasp of energy and vibration that physics would only formalize hundreds of years later. For all their superstitions, medieval people were keen observers, stitching together explanations from the threads they had. So what lingers after 8 centuries? Not just the thrill of unsolved puzzles, but the humbling realization that every era has its blind spots. We mock their fears of werewolves, yet our own anxieties about AI and pandemics might seem just as irrational to future historians. We dismiss their cursed jewels, yet who hasn't hesitated before a superstition? These mysteries endure because they're not just about the past, they're about us. They force us to ask, what stories will our civilization leave behind? What unexplained phenomena will future generations puzzle over? Now it's your turn. Which of these medieval mysteries sent a chill down your spine? Was it the ghost ships adrift with no crew, or the sleeping kings waiting beneath mountains? Drop your pick in the comments, and who knows, maybe your theory will be the one that finally cracks a case centuries cold. After all, history's greatest secrets aren't locked away in vaults or buried in crypts. They're hiding in plain sight, waiting for the right mind to whisper, "What if?"